Hey, man.
Hey,
So,
Greg. Happy snowy January.
yeah. Yeah, so I was saying, like, just to see a little peek, there's the Bomba Genesis behind me, happening here in New York. And, yeah, it's pretty awesome. But,
Mild and maybe 39 today in Portland, Oregon, and I'm loving it. Hey, we're going to talk about presentations, though. That's some good stuff. Let's do it.
yeah, as two of us who, like, I feel like we're meeting in this virtual OK Corral. I'm on one end of the country, you're on the other. But we're meeting here in the center as two guys, two gunslingers. And what are we slinging but just a passion and a love for great presentations? And so let's see what we got.
Let's do it.
All right, so why don't we start? Why don't I start with my six gun here? And I'm gonna ask you a question. So I know that what Event Builder is about. I know that you guys handle the back office production of webinar programs. But tell me, like, webinars have been around for a long time, So what about webinars are so 2017? As now we're in 2018. So what's so 2017 about webinars?
So 2017. Yeah, well, I feel like I've been around for a long time because I started in the business literally 18 and a half years ago. But I'll tell you what I think is we're no longer out there trying to prove to people what the business value proposition is of where a virtual presentation fits into your mix of tactics that you can go to market with. I think the thing that is still completely underutilized or underappreciated is the fact that the medium is different than the purpose or the intent, right? And you can use GoToMeeting or Skype for Business or whatever Zoom or whatever tool you want to use to meet, to train, to do a keynote, to have a class, to have a seminar, and each of those communication types evolves a little bit based on the nature of how you're going to connect and communicate. And yet we often see webinars only happen one way, which is hello and welcome to today's webinar. And 45 minutes later, maybe they take a little Q&A at the end instead of going, wait a minute, no, we wouldn't open up Microsoft Word and think there's only one way to write. Why do we open up GoToWebinar and think there's only one way to present? That's so 2017.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Like, even in PowerPoint, you open up PowerPoint, it says click to add title and click to add subtitle, and that very structure forces people to create awful presentations to begin with.
Yeah, that is exactly right. Yes, exactly. The whole normal view in PowerPoint that goes, hey, it's normal just to have words and outlines and bullet points. Yeah, it's just a misnomer.
So what would you say? Like, hello, welcome to the webinar. I mean, tell me about what structure doesn't work anymore. What doesn't work anymore in addition to that?
You know what? I would even say there's a time and a place. But if you're in our listening audience today, grab your pencil. I'm going to give you my 3-step plan that is how I do individual coaching up to working with Fortune 500 instructional design teams. Analyze, map, discover. What I always start with is tell me what you do in person before we talk about making your presentation online. I want to know who your audience is. How would you normally connect and interact? How do you walk on stage? Do you get introduced? Do you hand out handouts? When you hand out handouts, do you do that at the beginning of the class? Do you do it part of the way through the class? How do you handle formal versus informal interactions? Formal being, I know that when I get to this place in the presentation, I always ask this question or have the audience do this exercise. Informal is, Greg just raised his hand part of the way through the thing or just shouted out a question, and what? What do I do about that, right? In person, most people in person, Greg says, hey, but, and throws out a question. Most of the time, my response in person would be to acknowledge Greg and say, yes, you answer the question, or say, I'm going to cover that in a later part of the presentation. Can we do that? Or that's completely off topic. Would you catch me after the break, right? That's what normal human beings do in conversations and presentations, right? We wouldn't, if Greg asked a question in the typical webinar, you wouldn't ignore Greg for 30 minutes and then take the question at the end, right? That's not normal. But somehow we normalize that. So I start with analyzing what do you do in person, and then how do we map that to the set of the tools that we have. typically that's your interactions, your transitions between speakers. How do we get in and out, and how do we do those things that we would do in person? But how do we adapt that to a new medium, right? The medium theory or transmission theory of communication is that the medium adapts, transforms how we connect and communicate. So some platforms have more robust sets of tools. Some don't have as many different options. The question is, how do we map to the set of tools that we have? And then the third is to then discover. Sociologically, we notice what we lose before we notice what we gain. And if I had a nickel for every time somebody goes, yeah, webinars are all right, but I'd rather be there in person, I'd be on a yacht somewhere, and you'd be with me. Because every time we move into a new medium, there are some advantages to the new medium, and it's not just distance between New York City and Portland, Oregon. It's different ways we can connect and interact, analyze, map, discover. There are some new things that will help you connect, communicate, and be more impactful. And that's my simple process for how I take people, to say, how do we even approach this subject of webinars?
All right, man. So what I'm getting from all that is that, like, what was 2017 is that people are still stuck in a tool, letting the tool force their thing, rather than looking at what they would do in real life and trying to get the tools to do that.
Right.
That's becoming more modern, more 2018 and beyond.
Well, and here's the thing. Some part of that is totally obvious, and I've worked with a lot of executives, and they come back and go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Which is, if I told a story in a book, and then I tell a story in a movie, I realize that it could be the same story to the same audience, and it's a different discipline for how I communicate that through that particular medium. It's less obvious when I think that I'm just going to talk over PowerPoint, right? And so the other challenge is that we have webinar companies, conferencing platforms out there perpetuating bad practice. Don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but it's virtually every one of them steps up and goes, this is how you do a webinar. Introduction at the beginning. And then you come in and do 45 minutes of presentation content, and then Q&A at the end. And nobody does that in real life except in the context of a keynote. And unless you're trying to mimic doing a keynote presentation, most of the time there's some form of human connection that is just getting missed. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, keynote or a TED Talk. Everyone who comes to me said, oh, we want to make our talk like a TED Talk. I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah, as a guy who did a TED Talk in the Cayman Islands, yes, it's very different. That's not the normal way of communicating.
TED Talk is a performance. In fact, I was lucky. My wife got us tickets to Hamilton, and we saw Hamilton just last night in New York City. And it was an amazing performance. It was riveting. I was crying. Everyone was crying. And it was wonderful. But it was a performance. It wasn't a B2B presentation. And I think a lot of people are enamored by how beautiful these performances are, either on the TED stage or on a New York Broadway show stage. But that's not business. No. That's not a webinar. That's not a presentation.
Well, and it has its place. But that's the point. There's not a one way to give a presentation, just like there's not one way to write something on a piece of paper, and there's not one way to do a webinar.
So, Roger, you help a lot of people do this through this stuff. What do you see as like the biggest hurdle that people are facing, that deal with, that you help them with? What rises to the top? It's like the biggest deal. Biggest hurdle.
Well, you know what? Thanks, Greg. I mean, I think it was probably implied, though not explicit, in that little analyze, map, adapt. Most people notice what they lose, right? And they get wrapped up in the mechanics, as in, is this thing on? Are you hearing me? Right? And or how do I change my slide? Or they're worried about the mechanics instead of getting past the mechanics to say, how do I connect and communicate with people? Because, I mean, it's like a telephone. I've asked groups of CEOs this. I've said, how many of you have done customer service training? And when you teach people how to do customer service over the telephone, you teach them how to forward a phone call and then stop? No, actually, great customer service has nothing to do with how to operate the telephone. I need to know how to operate the telephone, but that's not where connection happens, right? And so if there's the biggest mistake, it's thinking about the technology and thinking about how the connection works, because especially, and slight self-interest here, people can help you with the technology, right? That's like the the band manager who goes and manages the backstage crew to make sure that the lights are on and the amps are plugged in, and you're the rock star and you step out on a stage. If you don't want to do all that yourself, somebody else can handle the stage for you, so you can step up and do your thing.
Well, it's not just the speakers that deal with that. It's like the people that come to webinars. They're like, oh, I can't see this screen, or your screen is frozen, or I can't, like, what's the email address? Will I get a recording of this? And it's like, your job is not to help people, like, with their stuff, with their IT. You're not like their IT person. Yeah. So, like, is that a hurdle that you see some people spend a lot of time not delivering content and value, but fixing IT issues?
Yeah. Well, yes, but let's keep it in context. Mm-hmm. If you had an in-person program at the local convention center, and there were going to be 500 people show up, somebody overslept, couldn't figure out how to pay their train ticket to take the train into town, or something, right? And to use that analogy in webinars, that's kind of like saying, wait a minute, if you haven't figured out in advance how to make sure that you don't oversleep or catch the train into town on time, I can't exactly be responsible for you, that, especially now that I'm on stage, right? Here's why that seems big to us. That seems big to us because we want everybody to be happy, right? And if there's one person in 500 who goes, I can't hear, the slides are frozen, or right? I mean, you have no idea. They could have, they could be 3 gerbils short of a good internet connection, and the other 499 people are doing great. And what do I see?
You said gerbils?
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly that's having somebody ride shotgun with you who can do that troubleshooting. But here's what I know from being in the industry for 18 years, not only working for the technology companies from startup to Microsoft, but then also being a consultant back until I joined Event Builder a year ago. For 10 years, I was speaking, training, coaching, consulting to and for Adobe and GoToWebinar and these companies. So I'm familiar under NDA with their metrics. The number of technical issues is really small relative to the vast majority of connections and minutes that people are having radically successful experiences, right? And it'd be no different than if you commute to the office the same route, the same time, and I know it takes me exactly 19 and a half minutes to get from door to door from my house to my office, but occasionally something happens. And it didn't take me 19 and a half minutes, right? We throw webinars under the bus. Here's also what we know technologically. Most of the time, and I mean the vast majority of time, technical problems are at the local end user perspective. And most of the time it's their own internet connection or their own out-of-date browser or something like that. So, the internet's more reliable in terms of getting signal from Portland, Oregon to New York City to Sydney, Australia. It's more reliable to go that long distance than it is to go from your local internet service provider to your desktop, right? More often than not, it's not GoToWebinar's problem, it's your problem.
Yeah, so that leads me to a next question here. So if you're producing an event that you've got 300 people showing up to in a physical room and you're on stage for that presentation, there's a lot of ingredients that make that event successful. You got to hire a lot of people, from that person that escorts people in, checks tickets, to the person that makes sure that the projector works right. With a webinar, the promise is that it's a lot easier because you've got this technology at everyone's fingertips. But is it? What are the ingredients that you need to ensure that, shit's not going to go leftwise? Or,
right. Yeah, exactly. Hit the fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, a good part of that is exception management, knowing what to do, not knowing what to, there's no problem when everything goes right. It's just something when something goes wrong. The first is to start with a professional tool, and God love them, but Skype is not it, right? We're just using this because you and I are having a conversation and making a recording. Skype for Business is it's entirely different, right? Most people don't even realize that Skype for Business, which is free in Office 365. So if you're subscribing to Microsoft Office online now, You get Skype for Business for free. So whether it's Skype for Business or Zoom or GoToWebinar or WebEx or Adobe Connect or one of literally 150 other tools, a professional tool is has not only more features for connecting and interacting, but for managing and troubleshooting. One of the biggest challenges with the quote-unquote moving parts is treating an event the same as a meeting, right? People tend to use I'll use GoToMeeting day in and day out for these little meetings. We show up right at the top of the hour. It's no big deal if Greg's 2 minutes late and blah, 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 right? But that's, if the offline equivalent is, hey, we show up to a conference room and Greg showed up 2 minutes late, no big deal, we'll roll with it. But when we're having an event, like you say, and there's 300 people showing up, I've got somebody out there who forgot to do something on their computer, or their internet connection's having a bad hair day, or something like that, and we need to be prepared not to show them how to get in the door. Sometimes that's showing them how to connect and interact. Most audiences figured out how to connect and interact in webinars. Some audiences don't, right? Depends on your demographic. And they're not as familiar with how do we connect and interact on Facebook. So
like my mother and father joining? Like, what do you mean demographic?
Yeah, well, yes. So I'll be careful with saying that's solely an age-based demographic, though generally that is more true, right? Mm-hmm. But some industries spend a lot less time developing their native digital skills, right? So, for instance, one of our clients is a large medical firm, and their audience is nurses. Well, nurses don't spend 8 hours a day in front of a computer like you and I do. They spend 8 hours a day taking care of people, and so it's not quite as natural for them to go, oh, that's how I chat a question into Greg because I've got a question about something that he just said. So there are times when part of the process you build in might be guiding people's experience to be more effective as audience members so they get more out of the experience.
So there's something that technology enables that's an ingredient not even available when you're in a room with 300 people, physical room. For example, seeing other people's questions that they're thinking about while the presentation is going on.
Yeah.
That's a feature that's only available because of technology, for example. So are there other ingredients that you've seen that really make magic happen with webinars in particular that are not even possible because in a room with 300 people?
Yeah, well, you just pointed out a great one, and let me riff off of that exact example. If you are a trainer and you were going to do a half-a-day training class, and to 15 people, you might kick things off by saying, go around the room and everybody tell me your name and what's your role in the organization, and what do you want to learn today before I get into the training content. And if 15 or 20 people took 1 minute each, you just consumed 15 or 20 minutes of your half a day, right? If you do that online, to your point, and everybody just went to a little chat box and typed it in, now it's simultaneous instead of sequential. Right. In person, I can only have one person talking at a time, right? Now we have a combination of those opportunities online. They could all type it in at the same time. And now it's sequential, and it only takes 1 minute instead of 20 minutes. And I just recovered 19 minutes of my training time. What am I going to do with that? In a bigger event, one of the things that I've seen happen, I won't mention the vendor because this will kind of throw them under the bus. I'm doing a webinar. I'm the keynote speaker for a big webinar for one of the conferencing vendors, and I said, I want to open up chat so everybody can chat, just like what you just described, where everybody can see that stuff. And they're like, oh, really? You want to do that? I'm like, bring it on, because I'm the unflusterable presenter. Let's just do it. So we get to the end, and here's something that I saw happen that my client then commented on, which was Karen asks a question. Julie jumps in and answers Karen's question before Roger got around to my next pause where I did audience interaction. And therefore, there was this peer-to-peer level engagement, which was happening online, by the way, which is a whole lot easier when different. That's a good example of something transformed online as opposed to off, right? In person, I could lean to my left or right, but I wouldn't be connecting and communicating with all 300 people.
Yeah, it couldn't happen in the same way, real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. So technology, 2018, things are changing, and it's awesome. and I'm excited. I've seen what magic, I call it magic, when you're in a virtual room with people and you really feel like you're in the same room with them because of the conversation and the comments and the questions. It's awesome. So I'm excited about the future. So, Gunslinger, what do you got for me? What questions do you have for me, man?
That's a good transition. Let me do this. Turn down your audio just a smidge. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Are you hearing some feedback?
All right, turn down my speakers. How's that?
There, just a little bit. Perfect. Well, no, you actually just mentioned something that I've seen you speak about on your website, which is approaching presentations conversationally. And a little bit earlier, we touched on the why TED isn't necessarily the perfect thing for everybody. But let me hit the ball over into your court, because that's your specialty. Why approach presentations conversationally?
Yeah, so things have really changed. I think when I was in the 90s, I remember one of my jobs was to count words on a paper with a clicker, a thumb clicker, so we could calculate the cost of translation. And that in the late 90s, it still was a time when information was really not free and not everywhere and trapped in people's heads. And when you went to a presentation, it was top down. It was very much, you have information, we need to understand that information, bring it on. But, the reality today and going forward, information is everywhere. Just ask Alexa, are you here? Let's see what she says.
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. Take a look at the help section of your Alexa app.
Perfect.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, I think that's because of the storm or something. But the point is, information is out there, and answers are cheap. Answers are everywhere. Just ask Alexa when she's connected to the internet. Ask. There she is again.
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. The help section in your Alexa app.
Or ask Siri. And so the point is that people come to your presentation, already have done the research. They understand a lot about what you're presenting, what your topic is, even if you're selling a service. There's all this information already available. So they come with questions typically. And so if you don't come to that meeting with the mindset of filling that gap of what they want to find out, what's most important to them, what they're trying to accomplish, if you come to that session with, please sit down and watch my 73-slide PowerPoint that I've worked so hard to show you, I guarantee you it's not going to be a good presentation.
Oh, and can I apologize to begin with for this very small font size that's on this first slide?
Well, that's just it. The reason why there's small font on those slides is because people think that they need to wordsmith everything that's on the slides, because they still think that the slide is something that is information that needs to be delivered and emailed and sent to someone. Which, by the way, if you can create a presentation with all this perfect information, wordsmith perfectly, and email it to 500 prospects, and they all can basically buy and like, oh yeah, this is awesome, this is exactly what we need, we're going to move forward right now. If you can do that, well, God bless you. But the fact is, if that was able to be done, you wouldn't need salespeople. You wouldn't need like all of us. You wouldn't need the human experience. And in fact, when you look at what business is, it's about building trust. It's about exchanging ideas. And if you show up with a canned presentation, like you did in the early 2000s even, with your, we have a branded PowerPoint template with like a blue bar at the top with a blue header on the bottom, that's like an ebook from the 90s. So that doesn't work anymore. And so this is a long answer. I'm sorry.
No. It's right on.
About, why is conversational presenting so important? It's because the whole universe has changed. People want to engage with you when you present. I mean, look at Facebook Live. I see people go on Facebook Live and they do presentations right there, and people are interacting, throwing up hearts and angry faces. And whether you as a presenter, you just choose to read the comments and interact is your choice. But you can see by the very nature of that kind of technology that people are want to interact with you and want to have an experience in that moment.
Yeah. So I kind of spoke to kind of my process for working with somebody. You, as I recall, kind of worked with typically mid or smaller organizations, 5,000 people or under. And so when you've got that subject matter expert or that executive or somebody in front of you, walk us through a process. How are you working with them to get them from what they think, what you just described as, I call it info barf. I'm going to show up and throw up, right? But how do you get them from there to the place where they're comfortable going, oh, yeah, I can actually talk to people like human beings?
Yeah, it definitely is a process. And it usually starts where we take a look at whatever they have as their PowerPoint, right? And these PowerPoints, these Prezis even, have evolved. They've evolved and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. They're not 72 slides now, they're 92 slides now. And so what these executives love is a step back and let's put the PowerPoint aside. And I start by really asking a couple questions like, describe the typical interaction you have. So you're in a room with, maybe it's virtual over the web, or maybe it's physical, with 5 people. It's about 30 minutes long. What are the 2, 3, 4, 5 bases that you really touch on in that conversation, presentation, whatever? Whether you're drawing on the board, whether you're showing PowerPoint, what are those bases that you touch? That by the end of touching all those bases, you know that you've touched everything. And they appreciate that question because those bases, by the way, are typically buried in that 92-slide PowerPoint. But they forget about that. They forget about those important bases because there's all this stuff. So that's the first step, is really getting them to acknowledge what those bases are. And the best presentations have 3 bases, beginning, middle, and end. Who we are, what we do, how we can help you. Past, present, future. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, you name it, the power of 3. This is already an archetype of how we think and present.
Right.
Steve Jobs used this all the time.
Yep. And that's science, right? That we know that. We know that 3. I think Stephen Kosslyn says 3 or 4, but we know that's science in terms of how the brain works. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. So they appreciate this process of getting them to distill their bases. And then it's like a 5-step process. I'm not going to go through it now, but
okay.
We take them through a process of mind mapping, which is awesome. It's like sneezing out all this stuff. And then we take them through a process of storyboarding and weaving in some archetypal stories. Is it a rebirth story? Is it a startup kind of story? Is it a comedy of integration of all these possibilities? So we try to weave in a story that makes it more interesting than just a solution pitch. And then we go to the design side, which are the details of how does it look? What words do you have on screen? What are the images? And all those details are really, really important to do a couple things. One, to help the presenters really stay in their zone of presenting and help the audience remember all those details. So I like to describe this as like a Venn diagram with 3 parts. I'll kind of draw circles here in space.
Yeah.
Where you have the topic in one circle, you have the presenter in another circle, which is you, and you have the audience's interest in this third circle. And the beauty of this triad is the zone is in the center. That's if you can stay there, which is you're kind of there shoulder to shoulder with your audience, talking about the topic, facilitating a discussion about their goals maybe and what they're trying to achieve around the topic, the challenges. That's the zone to stay in. And you have to do that conversationally. And you don't know their interest unless you ask.
So let me ask you this. Inevitably, that subject matter expert or that executive has more content than they have time to cover, right?
Yeah.
Let alone if they allow some space for dialogue, right? So if they've got 20 minutes or 2 hours, regardless of what their presentation time is, and they're going to allow a little space for that dialogue or conversation, that means there's even less room for all that content. How do you help them kind of overcome this, I got to info barf out more information?
It's really a mindset. And if you come to this conversation or presentation with a mindset that your presentation is more important than your audience's interest, then you're screwed.
That is a great way to put it. Say that again.
If
you think
if
your
you
information
come to the presentation thinking, if I come to this presentation thinking that my presentation, just wait, you got to hear it. My presentation is more important than your interest in this topic or in this, then I'm screwed. I'm messed up. And the reason why I'm messed up is because in order to deliver a conversational presentation, you have to honor their interest more than what you're prepared to talk about. Because if you don't, you won't value those moments where you may need to turn left or turn right or to include or to exclude. You won't know that if you come with your guns blazing without acknowledging what the target is.
Yeah. I know one of the things that I've heard you mention before is just the topic of trust. And that sounds actually like a good segue because we know it relationally in other relationships, like me and my significant other. If I do all the talking and I'm not doing any of the listening, she either starts to tune out and trust starts to erode. Just curious, why is trust such a hot topic for you, and how do you what mistakes do people make that erode trust in presentations as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, well, trust is basically everything. You won't get a customer to work with you unless they trust you. And so it is everything. And it is the reason why you're there, is to establish that trust, to foster that trust. And, you hear this, like the number one reason why you interview a buyer who just bought a $2 million solution. So tell me, Bob, why did you just buy this $2 million solution from vendor B instead of vendor A through C or A through F? And Bob will tell you, hands down, 9 out of 10 times, that we felt that this vendor really listened to us, this vendor understood us, and was able to meet our needs better than the other vendor. But it starts with understanding and, basically understanding. And so I don't know if I've answered your question there, but that's pretty much.
Well, so let's talk about types of presentations. Since I mean, personally, I love that topic, and I think you've got some additional insight that we haven't even fully mined. When you think about different purposes of presentations for people, like when you're helping them do something that's designed for a sales pitch versus maybe a pitch like a startup trying to get money pitch, delineate for me, what are there a couple, 2 or 3 or 4 types of presentations you spend most of your time working on, and what are some subtle differences that people should be aware of?
Well, I mean, we do a lot of investor decks, investor pitches, and those are different only in that they have to touch about 9 bases for them to be complete. Sales presentations really typically only need 3 bases. The problem, the impact of that problem, and how we're going to help you. For example, a startup pitch, they only need to know market, competition, other things. So it has more pieces to it. I think that's typically what we see in terms of structure. But the other elements are the same: the storyboarding, what is it a story about, how you're designing the presentation so that you have a conversation during it before, like in both cases, designing the presentation so you're starting out with a question like, here's this problem, what's at risk for you about this, or what are you hoping to accomplish around this, or this is an investment opportunity. What is important to you about finding the right investment opportunity? And I think while some investors like to be, cards to chest, just send me the deck, I'll make the decision.
Yeah.
Some investors actually like to get pitched, not talking about Shark Tank here,
right.
But if they do, then they definitely want to be included in that as a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, my experience is people they want to hold their cards to their chest, like you said. I've always thought, wait a minute, if we're really connecting and this is the right thing, you're not weakening your position or exposing yourself if you share with me what's important to you. So,
yeah.
One final thing comes to mind here as I'm thinking through these. I know we're kind of hitting in some different spots, but when we're talking about slides that complement the speaker, right? You just got done talking about, hey, yeah, sometimes there are some investors out there who just say, send me the deck. And yet even earlier you said, well, if you could just send the perfect deck, why do you need to make the in-person or live presentation, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to decks and speakers doing speaking, right? And that's kind of one of the messy things about the word presentation, right? Sometimes it means the act of presenting live, and sometimes it means the PowerPoint or what Prezi or whatever you're using, right?
Yes.
Tell me how you think of those things as either complementing each other or what's happening when they're not complementing each other.
Yeah, it's like Eskimos have 8 words for snow because they live in the snow all day. It's the wet snow, the fluffy snow. So, like, I'm coming up with like 8 words for presentation because it means so many different, meanings of that. But I think right now there's no trick around it. It's really just when you say you want to create a presentation, tell me what you mean. What are you trying to create? What's your objective of this presentation? Oh, don't you know we're just trying to create something that engages people? Well, what do you mean? Oh, we just want to be able to like send people something and they love it and they buy. Oh, okay. Right. So that's one animal. And I find that those type of presentation buyers are really just looking for great graphic design. And that's awesome. But that's not what I call a presentation. That's creating a really engaging ebook, or maybe that's creating a great landing page on your website. You'll need a web designer to help create an engaging landing page that, like Apple does this beautifully for their products.
Yeah.
They have these landing pages that are a mile long, and you just scroll and you enjoy. It's essentially a presentation of an iPhone 10, and that's great. And maybe in Apple's case, since it's B2C, they don't need to do presentations. But B2B, typically when some business is about to plunk down $500,000 or $250,000, they don't just do it from looking at a landing page. I'm not sure if you think that as well.
Yeah. All right. So being conscious of our listeners or viewers' time here, let me ask you one final question, which is, what is it that we could say, you and I could say here, a couple gunslingers going, having a coffee shop conversation that somebody's listening over, kind of listening in on. What's something that we could say now that we would never say to a potential client that just makes you want to go, that sucks? If you're going to do that, that sucks. What is it that just makes you kind of eye roll inside of your head and you go, oh my gosh, just out of curiosity, is there this massive mistake or thing that just makes you roll your eyes most?
Well, there's 2 things. There's one, like if I'm not dealing with the CEO, if we're not dealing with the owner of the message, sometimes we're dealing with people who just want to make other people happy, and they don't know what their bosses want, and they're guessing, and that's always difficult because then they think that the presentation needs to look like other presentations instead of owning their own message and their own visual and their own story. So that's like, that sucks. Another like that sucks is when people want to have presentations with all the words on the screen because they're afraid that they're going to forget that of what to present, and they want the words on the screen to be that crutch. And that's difficult when people are in that sort of nervous state. But we usually get them off of that state, just, that's a sucky period, by basically having them present with all the words there. But after they present once, you can take the words off, and the picture that's left is the trigger picture that allows them to remember anyway what they were going to say on that slide. And the fact they realize then that they can say it a lot easier because they're not tripped up by the words that are on the screen anyway. So that's more of a process, people getting comfortable with presenting.
Yes.
Okay. So
yes.
I'm not sure if that will help people here, but...
Well, no, actually, I think it does, and I'll share with you because here's how you and I could talk about that, but, we would never quite say that directly to a client, right? But the reason you and I have that guttural reaction is because at our core, we want to help somebody. We want to help somebody rock. what they're doing,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
whether they think they're going to use, same in webinars, right? Web people, you want to use the webinar as a teleprompter. So instead of looking at the camera right here, I'm looking down here at my slides, and you're looking at my forehead, and or the science of how cognitive. Yeah, well, yeah. What's the word I'm looking for? Cognitive load increases when somebody's trying to read at the same time you're speaking, and you've got these two disparate things happening, right? And so we know why and how we need to help people get from point A to point B. I know for me that same kind of sucks thing happens when either they're reading the slides or they actually literally want to read a script in webinars, right? It's
and I hear this all the time in webinars.
Yeah, and you just want to go, you know what? That's not human. Yeah. And oh, by the way, unless you are a professional voice talent, people can tell when you're reading. And so that even sucks worse, right? Because now you're not only going to suck, but people are going to know you suck even worse. And I just want to help people. And I think for me, and I'll leave this final thought with you, I think for me, one of the core things is I actually believe that most people could actually really rock their presentations. You don't have to be Steve Jobs. No. All you need to do is be you and talk about what you already have in your heart and in your head, and you're already set up to do that. And I think this has been a great few minutes with you. Any final closing thoughts here as we kind of get towards the end here?
That's that last thought there. I mean, that's like on the money. You know, we talked about trust before. People don't want to trust a charlatan. They don't want to trust someone who's a great public speaker. They just want to trust you because you're, you know, maybe boring, or maybe just that's who you are. And that's where the trust comes from, just being yourself. And so I think my advice to people is that the good news is they don't have to learn very much about presenting. They just have to structure their presentations in a way that allows them to be themselves.
Yeah. Greg, so appreciate a little bit of conversation here. If people need to get in touch with you, how do they find you?
Yeah, well, pitchkitchen.com is our agency, and that we're growing here, based out of New York, and you can reach us there.
Awesome. Roger here at Event Builder, eventbuilder.rocks, and you know what? It's been a wonderful time. I think we should do this again.
Awesome. Take care, Roger.
Goodbye, everybody. Take care.